In this talk that we have for the alumni, I'm meeting with Peter Ben Smit. He's our professor of contextual Bible interpretation. Welcome, Peter Ben.
Thank you.
The reason to invite you for this conversation is that you just published a very interesting book on men in Mark. Why? Well, it's in Dutch, but we will talk about this in English. Why about men? What's so specific about men?
Well, the flippant answer to that question is I always wanted to know more about myself. But the more serious answer is it's probably best told by means of an anecdote. At some point, I was teaching a class on masculinity studies, critical masculinity studies, and theology. And a student approached me afterwards, a male student, and told me, that was a very interesting class. I didn't know I had a gender. And with that anecdote, I want to illustrate that for very good reasons, much attention is being devoted to women in the sources of theology, women in religious communities today, or there's often a focus on queer approaches. Often the focus is very often on everything but the hidden norm, as it were. So recently we had some attention to the reference man in the Netherlands. So the hidden norm, the hidden anthropological norm, what it really means to be a human being is often measured against what it means to be male in a particular manner.
So basically you say masculinity is actually invisible because it is the norm.
Exactly, it's norms. What is normal in society often hides itself. And that also goes for dominant forms of masculinity that, although they are invisible, exercise an enormous amount of influence. And that is one reason why I'm interested in critical masculinity studies, in order to make this topic visible. And thereby also, when doing that, it also becomes possible to discuss it critically, to wonder whether everything that is self-explanatorily masculine or regarded as masculine needs to be regarded as such, what effect certain forms of masculinity have, and so on and so forth.
So does that also explain why gender studies is usually a field in which, for example, women and non-binary persons and others are involved, but not so many men?
Well, not so many heterosexual men. That's also, to make me even more specific, as yes, I think this field of studies, for very good reasons, the field of gender studies has an emancipatory agenda that I fully support. But critical masculinity studies is not an alternative to feminist research or an alternative to gay and lesbian studies or queer studies, but it's stands on the shoulders of these giants. But yes, these fields of study often focus, and as work in academia often does, on the extraordinary, whereas the quote unquote ordinary or the normal remains under-researched or invisible. The same goes for many contextual approaches to biblical studies. When you look at your average handbook in biblical hermeneutics, you have a whole list of approaches that are listed as academic or scholarly. And at the very back of the book, you have a section contextual approaches. And there we have everything Asian, African, Latin American, Black, womanist, queer, and so on and so forth. Why this kind of distinction? And often these,
Do you also have a section for a white European interpretations, or?
Well, that's usually the first 2/3 of such a handbook, but it's not labeled as such.
Precisely, it's maybe also contextual, but it's not called contextual because it's a norm.
Yes, there's a quotation from Jamet McCulloch, an English church historian, who refers to your standard historical critical approach as the enlightened quest for truth. So he frames it in very existential terms, or it makes it sound like a worldview, which of course it is part of. And I think, yes, contextualizing the methods that we commonly use, that we regard as normal, is very important.
I've sometimes wondered, Peter Ben, what is more difficult to unveil the marginal, let's say, non-dominant voices in Bible interpretation or in hermeneutics or in whatever, or to unveil the hidden norm?
I think both are difficult. I think it's especially very difficult to unravel, to make visible the hidden norm of which you yourself are part.
Yeah.
And that of course goes for me. I think it's relatively easy, well, not easy. I can be very intentional, or try to be intentional, to pay attention to voices from other contexts. But it does, I need those, but the other way around, I need those voices to make me aware of the kind of contextuality that I'm part of.
Yeah.
I must say maybe one note, I was very happy that in the production of this book, it was supervised by 2 female publishers. I would have felt very uncomfortable if that would not have been the case. I'm also very grateful that Manuela Kalski, another colleague of the faculty, a feminist theologian of some renown, has been willing to write a preface, which I think is also very important, because a man writing about man in a book written by a man that also writes about men is a tricky business.
Yeah, so precisely the quote you mentioned earlier, whether it really becomes critical masculinities, that requires this kind of detour to include other voices to, well, actually to clarify that what you are describing as one perspective is not just repeating that hidden norm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. When studying the man in Mark, what did you learn?
Well, the first thing I learned is that I should have written 2 books. This is much more to the subject than can be captured, can be dealt with in one book. One of the things I thought was fascinating is how diverse the kind of masculinity is that some men, especially Jesus, embody. But Jesus can be, well, let me take 2 examples. In a meeting between Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus is tired, he's hiding inside of a house, he doesn't want to talk to anyone, which is, by Greco-Roman standards, very unmasculine behavior. Man should be should appear in public, be willing to confront others, be in control of himself, not hiding out of fear or out of fatigue, and also be in control of others. Then we have this Syrophoenician woman barging in, violating Jesus' space, confronting him, besting him in a discussion, a famous conversation about children, bread, dogs, and crumbs. And Jesus seems to accept this, even praises the woman for her persistence and faith, and heals her daughter. Then we have a completely different story when Jesus confronts Pharisees, or is confronted by Pharisees, regarding the question whether it is permissible for a man to send away his wife in Mark 10. Often a pericope entitled Jesus about marriage or Jesus about divorce. It's really about are husbands allowed to send away their wives without further ado? This is a confrontation that takes place in public between men talking about a woman. So a very, well, testosterone-filled story, you might want to say. And here Jesus does not give in at all, remains very much in control of himself, also controls his opponents, with as outcome a teaching that is to protect the status of a woman in a relationship or in a marriage. Men are not allowed to send send their wives away without further ado. So here you have 2 completely different performances of masculinity. One, by Greco-Roman standards, or by the standards of the 1st century, or general standards of the 1st century, very unmasculine, and the other hegemonically or ideotypically masculine. Both are part of this lesson, which suggests that the performance of masculinity on the part of Jesus is very contextual.
Just to challenge you, Peter, isn't this just a nuanced way of being a man?
Well, I'd hope so.
Well, just one other example. There's movies like The Fast and the Furious and Die Hard and so on, and these are really the typical macho kind of guy that is being portrayed. But all of them, they have their weak spots. They have their, especially in the relational field, they are they can be very soft and approachable and all that. So there's always this nuance kind of thing that apparently is also in the biblical story.
Yes, it's there. Yet, even if it is only this, I would say that this is a welcome insight, as it goes beyond ideas about man always being strong or always being having to. If the result is a multidimensional or a flexible way of performing masculinities, of performing masculinity, I think much has been gained. And the outcome is that being a man doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in each and every situation. Sure, why not?
Yeah. Well, maybe one of the questions here would also be for me that whether let's say the nuance that can be found in our own ordinary reality, hopefully, the nuance that can be found in the Bible may not always be there in theological concepts, which tend to overemphasize like one aspect, for example, the suffering Christ or the victorious. Theology may actually be more one-sided than the biblical scriptures stories or our reality.
True, and that's one reason why it's so fascinating to deal with texts such as the Gospel of Mark. It's not a discursive text in the sense it explains to you masculinity, explains to you in a conceptual way what Christ it has topics to unfold narratively, which takes time. Which allows for many different scenes and settings in which it becomes slowly but surely clear what sort of person Jesus is, what sort of Christ, what sort of Messiah he is. And therefore also for a more nuanced or complex or multifaceted way of what it means to be man. You just referred to the suffering Christ. That is in fact a good example. There is this tension that's never really resolved in the Gospel of Mark. On the one hand, Jesus goes to his death willingly. Mark 10:45, the Son of Man has come to serve and to serve and to give his life for many, which is an active formulation. On the other hand, he handed over, which is and these two sides of the coin of Jesus's suffering and death remain intact, and it's I think this complexity that makes the narrative also so appealing or even or attractive, at least to me. So this well, it's very realistic in this sense.
Yeah. Now I've read several books, Peter Ben, that describe biblical manhood. For example, by looking at different figures in Old Testament or in the New Testament. Describing, for example, different types that you would have among the disciples or among the prophets or well, anything like that. Is your book one of those?
To the extent that it is also gospel and so on, yes, it is. No, it isn't, as I don't believe. I don't create a typology of masculinities, for instance, and my aim is more explorative. More asking, well, what's happening in this text, what's happening in this text, rather than having a particular aim. It's not meant to instruct man how to be man, or to say, well, you've got 5 options, pick one. Rather, it's meant as a mirror to invite readers, women, men, non-binary persons, to reflect on their it's about 2,000 years old, to relate it to performances of gender, continue to. So I think the Gospel of Mark means to engage the text, ask the questions the text asked itself in its time, and to wonder what it's about today. As I think the relationship between masculinities and religion is just as important as it was 2,000 years.
And knowing your work, it's never only about what the text really says. It's always about what readers also see in the text, how they appropriate it, and so on. Would you say that you've written it differently than a female scholar would have done?
Yes, I should be aware of the fact that I'm male, identifies as masculine, that I'm white, that I'm heterosexual, and so on and so forth. But it does not necessarily mean that the book could not have been written by somebody else. Of course, I would have liked to read other books about the same topic written by other people with different perspectives, but that's not your question.
Well, that sounds like a great invitation. And of course, there's always the invitation to read the book first and to see how people respond to your book. Thank you so much for this talk. I think it's great, and indeed the hidden norm that you describe in many ways is being put on the table. in your book and in other work. And I look forward to getting the responses and the reviews and see how people get to what you're doing. Thanks for your work, Peter Ben, and thanks for this talk.
Thank you, Ruard. And I also look forward to responses to my book, as that's the only way to further scholarship. Thank you very much.
Bye.